It was late October of 2017 when I decided to do something I'd never done before. Camp alone in a graveyard. I was 23 then, a photography student at a small college in northern Ohio. I had this obsession with taking long exposure shots at night, especially in places people normally avoided. Old barns, empty playgrounds, quiet gas stations. That night, I wanted something different. Something that would make people uncomfortable when they saw it. That stillness mixed with the thought of death nearby. There was an old cemetery just outside a small town called Benton Ridge. I'd driven past it a few times before on my way to a friend's house. It sat off a narrow 2-lane road, surrounded by trees that looked almost black at night. The sign at the front said, Ridgeview Cemetery, EST 1886. The place was small, maybe a few hundred graves, a lot of them so old the stones leaned sideways or had letters chipped away by rain. There wasn't any gate, just a rusted chain across the entrance you could easily step over. That Friday night, I left around 9:30 p.m. It was already cold enough to see my breath when I loaded my gear into my car. A cheap tent, a small sleeping bag, my camera, tripod, flashlight, and a thermos of coffee. I told myself I'd camp until sunrise, take as many photos as I could, and head home before anyone noticed. When I got there, the sky was completely clear. The moon was thin and the air smelled like wet leaves and old dirt. The sound of crickets was sharp in the stillness. I parked a little down the road so no one would see my car and walked in carrying my stuff. The grass was damp and uneven, soft enough that every step sank just a little. My boots left prints in the dew. I found a flat spot near the back corner, close to a cluster of tall oaks. It looked like no one had been back there for a long time. The stones were small and covered in moss, and one of them was broken clean in half, like it had been hit by a mower years ago. I set my tent up right beside it, trying not to think about how close I was to someone's grave. Once the tent was up, I boiled some water on a small camp stove and made instant noodles. The steam looked thick in the cold air, and for a few minutes it felt kind of peaceful. I could see the faint lights of the town far away through the trees, but here it was just darkness and silence. Every little sound stood out. The creak of branches, the soft hum of wind moving through the grass, the distant bark of a dog. Around midnight, I started setting up my camera. I wanted to capture the moonlight across the gravestones. The long exposures took minutes each, so I had a lot of time just standing there, watching the tiny screen, hearing nothing but the click of the shutter. After about an hour, I noticed something. A faint flicker of light deeper in the cemetery. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe from my flashlight catching on a stone or some glass. But when I turned my light off, I could still see it. A dim orange glow moving slightly. It looked like a candle or maybe a lighter flame. It disappeared behind a line of trees, then came back. I froze, standing completely still. My heart started thudding in my chest. It wasn't bright enough to be a car or a phone flashlight. It was too steady, too warm. I kept telling myself maybe someone else had the same idea I did. Maybe another photographer. But it didn't make sense. Who else would camp in a graveyard at 1 a.m.? I crouched down low and watched. The light moved slowly between the headstones, stopping every few feet, like whoever it was kept kneeling or looking at something on the ground. The quiet made it worse. I couldn't hear any footsteps, no voice, just that small glow drifting among the graves. After about a minute, it vanished completely. I waited, staring at the spot where it had been, but nothing came back. My hands were shaking a little, partly from the cold and partly from that creeping fear that I wasn't supposed to be there. I decided I'd pack up and leave before sunrise. I didn't want to cross paths with whoever was out there. I got back into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to lie still. Every little rustle outside made my chest tighten. I could hear the wind shifting through the trees, but there were other sounds too, faint ones, like someone stepping slowly on wet grass. Not constant, just once or twice spaced apart. At one point, I thought I heard something metallic, a soft, scraping sound, like someone dragging a small shovel or piece of metal. I held my breath, waiting, staring at the tent's thin fabric wall that fluttered slightly in the wind. The sound stopped after a few seconds, but I couldn't make myself close my eyes again. Around 2:30 a.m., I checked my phone. No signal. My coffee was cold. My mouth was dry. I decided I couldn't just stay in there waiting. I unzipped the tent as slowly as I could and looked out. The moon had gone behind clouds now, and everything was darker. I aimed my flashlight toward where I'd seen the glow earlier, but there was nothing, just stones and trees and empty space. Then I saw something new. A small, freshly disturbed patch of dirt about 10 feet from where I was camped. The ground around it was darker, damp-looking, like someone had dug there recently. There were scuff marks in the mud, the kind made by boots. I knew I hadn't seen that earlier when I'd picked this spot. That's when my body just decided for me. I packed everything as fast as I could. Didn't even fold the tent right, just shoved it into my bag. I didn't care about the noodles, the tripod, any of it. I just wanted out. My hands kept fumbling, and the flashlight beam shook all over the place. As I started walking back toward the road, I heard another sound, a muffled thump, like something heavy falling into soft ground. I didn't turn around. I didn't even breathe until I was over the chain at the entrance and halfway to my car. When I finally got inside and locked the doors, I sat there for a full minute just listening. The night outside was dead quiet again, as if nothing had ever happened. No lights, no footsteps, no sound at all. I drove home without looking back once. When I got to my apartment, it was nearly 4 a.m. I couldn't sleep, so I uploaded the photos right away. Most of them were just what I expected, long, blurry shots of gravestones and trees, the faint line of my tent in one of them. But in one photo, taken around midnight near the edge of the frame, there was a shape. It wasn't clear, just a faint outline of someone crouched down near the ground, half hidden behind a stone. The orange glow I'd seen was right next to them, and something shiny, maybe metal, reflected the light. 2 days later, I went back in daylight, just to convince myself it wasn't as bad as I'd imagined. The cemetery looked harmless under the sun. Birds were chirping, the grass was still damp, and there were a few fresh flowers on some graves near the front. But when I walked to the back, to the place I'd camped, I stopped cold. The patch of dirt I'd seen disturbed before had been smoothed over, like someone had come back and fixed it. But next to it, there was a small piece of cloth sticking out of the ground, dark, muddy, and torn. I didn't touch it. I just turned and walked back to my car, heart pounding in my ears. A week later, I read a small article online about a man found buried near Ridgeview Cemetery. It said police believed it was a missing drifter, maybe dead for only a few weeks before someone tried to hide the body there. They didn't mention suspects, only that the grave looked like it had been covered up more than once. I stopped taking night photos after that. I still think about that night, how close I was to something I shouldn't have seen, how someone else was out there doing something terrible while I stood only a few feet away. Sometimes I wonder if they saw me, too, and if that small orange light I saw wasn't just some candle, but someone's way of checking that their secret was still buried. It was in late October of 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the woods of northern Montana. I was 28 at the time, working long hours in construction, and needed a few days away from people, traffic, and noise. I had been to that area once before with friends years ago, but this time I wanted to be alone. I packed my old green tent, sleeping bag, a few cans of food, a flashlight, and a small hunting knife. Nothing fancy, just the basics. The weather forecast said there would be light rain that evening, but I didn't think much of it. I figured it would pass quickly. I reached the area just before sunset. The air was already damp, the sky covered in thick, gray clouds that seemed to press down on the hills. The forest was dense, full of dark pine trees that blocked most of the light. I parked my truck on a narrow dirt path and walked about half a mile into the woods until I found a clearing big enough to set up my tent. The ground was uneven, covered with pine needles, small rocks, and patches of wet mud. I set up my tent near a fallen log and got a small fire going before the rain started. The smell of wet earth filled the air, heavy and raw. I ate a can of beans straight from the tin, sitting near the fire as the wind picked up. The trees creaked and swayed, and every now and then I could hear something moving in the distance, probably an animal. The first drops of rain began falling softly, tapping against my tent and gear. It wasn't bad at first, just a light drizzle, but soon it became heavier, the kind of rain that soaks through your clothes in minutes. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped it shut. Inside, it was dark and damp. The rain drummed on the tent's surface in a steady rhythm. I laid back in my sleeping bag, listening to it. I could smell the faint scent of wet nylon and smoke from the fire that had just gone out. For a while, I just listened. Rain, wind, branches breaking somewhere far off. The kind of sounds that usually relax you when you're out there alone. But around midnight, something changed. The rain was still pouring, but I started hearing another sound mixed in with it. It wasn't the usual noises you hear in a forest. It sounded like slow, heavy steps on wet ground. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, the kind of illusions that come when you're tired and alone in the dark. But it came again, crunch, squish, pause, then another step. The steps were not far off, maybe 30 or 40 feet from the tent. They would stop for a moment, then continue, moving closer each time. I held my breath and stayed still. My flashlight was within reach, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I kept telling myself it was probably a deer or maybe a moose, something large but harmless. The rain would make any animal's steps sound heavier anyway. The steps stopped completely after a minute or two. The only sound was the rain slapping against the tent. I waited for a long time, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, before I let my muscles relax again. I tried to fall asleep, but my heart was still racing. I turned to one side, pulling the sleeping bag closer, and tried to focus on the rain again. Sometime later, could have been an hour or maybe less, I woke up suddenly. There was a faint noise outside, like something brushing against the tent. Not the wind, not branches, but something dragging lightly across the nylon fabric. It happened once, then again, moving slowly along the side. I froze completely. My throat went dry, and I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. It stopped for a moment, and then I heard something much clearer, the sound of wet breathing. Someone or something was breathing just outside the tent wall. Slow and heavy, the kind that comes from being cold or tired. I could feel the air shift with every exhale. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My first thought was that maybe a bear had wandered into the area, drawn by the smell of food. But bears don't breathe like that, and they sure as hell don't move that slowly around tents. I reached quietly for the knife beside my sleeping bag. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep a grip on it. The breathing stopped suddenly, and for a few seconds there was nothing, just silence and the endless patter of rain. Then came the sound of footsteps again, this time circling the tent. Slow, steady, deliberate. The ground squished with each step. Whoever it was wasn't trying to be quiet. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't see anything, and if I unzipped the tent, I'd expose myself completely. The steps went around once, then again, then stopped at the back of the tent. I heard a faint rustle, like someone kneeling or crouching in the mud. Then something pressed gently against the back wall of the tent, just enough to make the fabric bend inward. My breath caught in my throat. The pressure stayed there for a few seconds before releasing. Then silence again. Minutes passed. I didn't move. My body was tense, muscles cramping, knife clutched in my hand. I must have stayed like that for at least half an hour before I realized I couldn't hear anything anymore. The rain was still going, but whatever had been out there was gone, or at least I hoped it was. When dawn finally came, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped outside. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, and the forest was filled with fog. Everything was soaked, the ground, the trees, my tent. I walked around the clearing, my boots sinking into the soft mud. That's when I saw them. Footprints, human ones, bare feet, wide and long, pressed deep into the wet soil. They went all around my tent, circling it several times, and then led off toward the trees. The prints were fresh, the edges sharp from the rain that must have stopped not long before I came out. There was no sign of clothes, shoes, or anything else, just those footprints disappearing into the woods. I followed them for a short distance, maybe 20 or 30 feet, before I stopped. The fog was thick and visibility was low. I didn't want to wander too far in case I lost track of my camp. I turned back, packed up my things as fast as I could, and left. The whole time I was packing, I felt like someone was watching me from the trees. Every sound, the wind, the dripping branches made me jump. When I finally reached my truck, I looked back once. The fog had swallowed most of the clearing, and the woods looked even darker than before. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling didn't leave me until I was miles away from that place. That night, when I got home, I checked the local news online, just out of curiosity. There had been a report from a few weeks earlier about a man who had gone missing not too far from that area. They said he was last seen hiking alone, and that his car had been found parked near one of the forest trails. No one had found him since. I didn't go camping alone after that. I still think about that night sometimes. The slow footsteps, the breathing, those bare footprints circling my tent in the rain. I tell myself it was just some lost hiker, maybe confused, maybe trying to find shelter. But deep down, I know something wasn't right. It wasn't just the footsteps or the breathing. It was how quiet everything went after. How whoever it was never said a word, never made a sound besides moving. Just waiting there, outside the thin wall of my tent, in the middle of the rain, as if they wanted to see how long I'd stay still before doing something. And the strangest part, those footprints weren't leading to my tent from anywhere. They started right behind it, like whoever it was had been there all along, waiting before I even arrived. It was late September of 2019 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in northern Arizona. I had been working long hours at a warehouse in Flagstaff and needed to clear my head. I'd done solo camping trips before, so it didn't feel like anything new. I packed light, just a tent, sleeping bag, knife, flashlight, a small stove, some food, and a map of the area. The plan was to drive out past the smaller trails that most tourists never touched and camp for 2 nights before heading back. I wanted complete quiet, no cars, no people, no cell signal. Just the kind of silence that you can feel pressing against your ears. The drive took me most of the day. I followed a narrow dirt road that ran through the pine forest for what felt like forever. The road became rough with loose gravel and deep ruts, but my old Jeep could handle it. The sun started dipping behind the trees when I finally found a clearing big enough for my tent, surrounded by tall pines and red dirt. The air smelled like dry wood and dust. I could still hear crickets and some far-off bird calls. Felt right. After setting up my tent, I built a small fire. I didn't plan on staying up late, but I wanted to warm up some canned chili and boil water for tea. I ate slowly, listening to the forest. When it got dark, it got really dark. The kind of dark that eats everything. My flashlight beam barely stretched beyond a few feet. There were no stars that night. Thick clouds had rolled in, and the air had gone still. I remember the first strange thing clearly because it didn't seem strange at first. I heard what I thought was a coyote yipping somewhere off in the woods. It was distant, but sharp. Then another answered, closer. I'd camped enough to know the sounds of coyotes, but there was something off about it. It wasn't quite right. The pitch was too long, the rhythm strange. It almost sounded like a person trying to mimic a coyote. I brushed it off, told myself it was my imagination or maybe just a coyote with a weird call. I put out the fire around 10 and crawled into my tent. I lay there listening to the wind and the forest noises. Eventually, I must have drifted off because when I woke up again, it was dead silent. Not a single sound. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just silence heavy enough to make my heartbeat feel loud. Then I heard something move. It was faint, but I knew the difference between the rustle of a rabbit and the slow, deliberate steps of something heavier. It came from behind my tent, crunching lightly on the dry pine needles. I froze. I didn't move a muscle. My flashlight was within reach, but I didn't want to turn it on yet. The steps circled halfway around the tent, stopped for a long moment, then started again from the opposite side. I could almost feel the presence outside, standing there. I waited, barely breathing. Then came the sound, a deep, slow sniff, like something taking in my scent through the thin nylon wall. I could feel the hairs on my arms rise. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would give me away. The sniffing stopped, and after another few seconds, the sound of footsteps faded into the trees. I stayed completely still for almost an hour before daring to move again. When I finally looked at my watch, it was just after 3 in the morning. I didn't sleep again. At dawn, the forest seemed normal again. Birds were chirping, light cutting through the trees. But when I stepped out of my tent, I saw the prints in the dirt. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, maybe a deer, but they weren't. They were bare footprints, long, narrow, human-like, but wrong somehow. The toes were spread wide, and the heel mark was deep, like the thing that made them had put a lot of weight into each step. They went right up to the back of my tent and then veered off into the woods. I packed up my stuff fast, but I didn't leave immediately. I told myself I'd hike a bit farther and find a better spot, maybe near a small creek I'd seen on the map. I convinced myself the prints were probably from some hiker or hunter, but that didn't explain why they were barefoot or why they came so close to me in the middle of the night. I hiked for about 2 hours through the forest. The sun was high now, and everything looked harmless again. I found the creek and decided to refill my bottles. As I crouched by the water, I noticed movement in the trees across the creek. Something tall and still, partly hidden by the shadows. My first thought was that it was a person, maybe a hunter, but it didn't move like one. It was too still, too long in the limbs. I stood up and stared for a while, but as soon as I blinked, it was gone. That's when the smell hit me. It was like rotting meat mixed with something sour and wet. I looked around, expecting to see a dead animal nearby, but there was nothing. I filled the bottles fast and got out of there. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every step felt heavier. The trees seemed closer together, and the forest had gone quiet again. I found another clearing a mile away and stopped for lunch, but I couldn't eat. My stomach felt tight. I tried to distract myself by writing in my small notebook. I always took notes when camping, but my hands were shaking too much to write properly. I heard a snap in the distance, like a branch breaking, and that was it for me. I decided I wasn't spending another night out there. I packed everything back up and started heading toward where I'd parked the Jeep. The problem was, I couldn't find the same trail I came in on. I kept walking, but nothing looked familiar. The trees all looked the same. I tried using my compass, but the needle kept jittering slightly. I told myself I just needed to keep heading south. Eventually I'd hit the dirt road. But the deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. I kept hearing faint sounds, soft steps behind me, always stopping when I stopped. Once, I turned fast enough to catch a glimpse of something pale ducking behind a tree. I picked up the pace, my breathing sharp. After another half hour, I heard something again. Not behind me this time, but ahead. It was faint, but it sounded like someone trying to call my name, except they were saying it wrong, dragging out the vowels, the tone all twisted. It was my name, but it didn't sound right. I didn't respond. I just kept walking faster, trying to focus on the sound of my own footsteps. By the time I finally stumbled onto the dirt road, the sun was dipping again. I don't remember how far I walked, but my legs were shaking and my shirt was soaked with sweat. When I saw my Jeep in the distance, I nearly ran. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors immediately. My hands were trembling when I turned the key, and the sound of the engine starting felt like the best thing I'd ever heard. As I started driving, I looked in the rearview mirror once, just once. At the edge of the road, maybe 30 or 40 feet back, I saw something step out from the trees. It was tall, lean, and almost human, but not quite. Its arms hung too long, and its skin looked stretched tight over its bones. It just stood there, watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't look again. I drove until I reached the highway and didn't pull over until I was back in town, parked under a streetlight outside a gas station. I sat there for almost an hour before I finally started breathing normally again. I never went back to that area. I never even looked at a map of it again. A few weeks later, I checked the notebook I'd brought with me. On one of the pages, where my handwriting got shaky, there was dirt smeared across the paper and a single faint fingerprint. It wasn't mine. It was longer, thinner, almost claw-like. That was the last time I ever camped alone. Even now, when I drive through the forests in northern Arizona, I can't help but scan the tree line. Sometimes, when the wind dies and the forest goes quiet, I swear I can smell that same rotten, sour scent again. And I don't wait around to find out what's making it. It was late July of 2012 when I decided to go camping alone for a weekend. I just turned 24, and things had been heavy lately. Bills piling up, my job feeling like a slow suffocation. I needed air, space, quiet. My uncle owned a large piece of land outside of Custer, South Dakota. The farm wasn't used anymore, not since he'd gotten too old to manage the cattle. The barns were still there though. Faded red paint, broken doors, weeds high enough to hide your ankles. I figured it would be a good, private place to clear my head. I left early that Saturday morning around 6 with my small tent, sleeping bag, a cooler of food, and my old truck that had half a muffler. The drive took me a few hours. The weather was clear, dry heat, a slow wind coming from the west. When I turned off the main road, the dirt track leading to the farm was rough and narrow, lined with untrimmed trees that scraped my windows. It looked abandoned in that way places do when no one's touched them for years. When I parked near the old barn, I just sat for a while, windows down, listening. No sound but insects, the distant hum of the wind moving through grass. I could see the empty pastures stretching out for what felt like miles. The fences had gaps, and the wooden posts leaned as if tired. It felt peaceful, but in that strange, quiet way that makes you feel like something is listening back. I unloaded my things and decided to set up camp behind the barn, near the field that sloped gently toward a small creek. The ground was dry and uneven, the soil packed and cracked in places. I pitched my tent close to a line of tall corn stalks that had grown wild since the farm had gone empty. They weren't neat rows anymore, just scattered stalks, leaning into each other. I liked the spot though. It was hidden from the road, quiet, shaded by a half-dead oak tree. By afternoon, the sun was brutal. I walked around the property for a bit, exploring. There were old tools rusted in the dirt, a pitchfork missing a tine, a shovel handle broken in half, a wheelbarrow turned upside down. The farmhouse itself stood at the top of the hill, its paint almost gone, windows dark, the front steps caved in. I didn't go inside. I didn't feel the need to. Places like that hold a kind of stillness that you don't want to disturb. As the sun started to set, I built a small fire near my tent. I made simple food, a can of beans and some bread. The smell of smoke and warm dirt mixed with the sweet scent of the nearby corn. Crickets started their endless noise as the sky turned orange, then deep purple. I watched the light fade, feeling that strange mix of calm and alertness that comes with being completely alone. There's something about empty land at night, how it makes you realize how small you really are. By the time I crawled into my tent, the temperature had dropped. The air smelled damp, like soil after watering. I lay there listening, insects, the occasional croak of a frog, the faint rustle of wind through dry leaves. It was peaceful for a long time. I must have been half asleep when I heard something faint. It wasn't loud, just a quick, sharp crack, like a twig snapping under weight. Came from the direction of the corn. I stayed still, eyes open in the dark, heart starting to pick up. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a deer, but then I heard it again. Slower this time, a crunch of dry dirt. Footsteps, maybe. I waited. The noise stopped. For a while, I lay there staring at the dim shape of the tent ceiling, every sound outside amplified. My breath, the wind, the insects. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But then, a new sound, not a footstep this time. Something brushing against the side of the tent. Light but deliberate. Fabric shifting under a hand or something passing too close. I froze. My skin prickled all over. I didn't move. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. After a few seconds, the brushing sound moved toward the back of the tent, then stopped completely. Nothing, just silence. The crickets had gone quiet too, which made the silence worse. I reached slowly toward my flashlight. When I turned it on, the beam hit the thin tent walls, turning them pale white. I saw nothing through the fabric. After a long time, I unzipped the front of the tent and stepped out. The air outside was cold and still. I swung the flashlight around the campsite. The fire had gone down to glowing embers. My cooler was still there. The grass looked undisturbed. Then I pointed the light toward the cornfield. For a second, I thought I saw movement, just the tops of the stalks swaying slightly. But the air wasn't moving. I walked a few steps closer. The smell of dirt and dry corn was thick. I waited, listening, every muscle in my body tense. Then I heard it again, faint, deep in the field. A single rustle, then another. That was enough. I backed away slowly, keeping the light pointed forward. When I got back to my tent, I didn't go inside. I sat on the ground beside the fire pit and fed it more wood until it burned bright again. I stayed there for hours, just watching the flames, eyes scanning the edges of the light. At some point, maybe around 3 in the morning, I heard something metallic. A short, sharp sound like something hitting an old piece of machinery. Came from near the barn. I turned the light that way but saw nothing. The barn door was half open, the shadows inside thick as tar. I wanted to believe it was the wind, but there wasn't any. The air was dead still. I didn't sleep that night. I waited for dawn, and when the first bit of light broke over the field, I packed my things. The corn looked normal in the daylight, yellow-green, dry, harmless. The barn looked smaller somehow. I thought maybe I'd overreacted, that it had just been animals. I almost laughed at myself, but when I walked toward the barn to take one last look, I saw something that made my stomach twist. In the dirt just outside the open door, there were footprints, bare feet. Not huge, but definitely human, clean edges, deep impressions in the dry soil. They circled the barn, leading toward the side where the tools were, then back into the field behind it. I stood there for a long time just staring at them. The prints were fresh from the night before, maybe only hours old. There were no tire tracks, no other signs of a vehicle. Whoever had made them had walked here, or maybe lived close enough to come through the fields unnoticed. I didn't bother to look further. I threw my tent and cooler into the truck bed and left without even checking if everything was tied down. The dirt road back to the highway felt longer than it had the day before. I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see someone walking behind me on the road. I didn't tell my uncle about it. I didn't tell anyone. But a few weeks later, when I was back home, I saw a small story online. It was buried under other local news, a short article about an abandoned property near Custer. Some hikers had found a small camp set up behind an old barn, with blankets, food cans, and clothing that didn't belong to anyone who lived nearby. The sheriff said someone had probably been staying there for months without anyone knowing. I didn't need to see the pictures to know which place they were talking about. It was the same farm, the same barn. Even now, I think about those footprints in the dirt, how quiet the air had been, how still everything got before the sound started. And I think about how close that person must have been. Just a few feet from my tent, standing in the dark, watching me while I lay there thinking I was alone. I never went camping again after that. I still remember that trip like it happened yesterday, even though it's been more than 10 years now. It was the summer of 2014, and I had just turned 23. I was restless, always looking for some quiet escape from the city. Back then I lived in northern Oregon, not too far from the base of Mount Hood, and I developed this habit of solo camping. It started as a way to clear my head, but the more I did it, the more I liked the silence. That kind of deep silence that feels alive, where every little noise feels like it has weight. That weekend, I decided to camp near a small creek I'd found months before while hiking. It wasn't an official campground, just a patch of open ground beside a line of alder trees, maybe a 30-minute walk from the nearest dirt road. It was hidden, quiet, and nobody ever came by. The creek ran clear, shallow enough to cross without getting my knees wet, and there was this constant trickle sound that somehow made everything feel calm. I got there around 4 p.m. The sky was overcast, thick with those gray Oregon clouds that make everything look colder than it really is. I set up my small green tent facing the creek, laid out my sleeping bag, stacked some dry wood I brought in a net bag, and started a small fire just before dusk. The air smelled like wet bark and pine sap. After I ate, just canned beans and bread, I sat by the fire and watched the light fade. The forest went from pale green to blue, then to that heavy, grainy blackness that makes you aware of every sound. I remember hearing the water, the distant hum of wind, the occasional cracking branch somewhere deeper in the woods. Normal stuff. Around 9 p.m., the temperature dropped fast. I zipped myself into the tent, left the fire smoldering low, and scrolled through some songs on my old iPod. After a while, I turned it off and just listened. The sound of the creek made me sleepy, but every now and then, there'd be something else. A rustle, a crunch, the dull thud of something soft moving across dirt. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or maybe a deer. They were common out there. I tried to ignore it and closed my eyes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was closer than before. The crunching wasn't random anymore. It had a rhythm. A few steps, a pause, a few more, like something careful. At some point, I sat up and looked through the tent flap. My fire had gone nearly out, just glowing orange at the edges. The woods beyond were dark, no movement, no shape I could make out. I told myself again that it was nothing and went back down. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember was waking up in total silence. It was about 2:30 in the morning. The forest was dead quiet. No insects, no wind, nothing. The only thing I could hear was the faint dripping of water somewhere. I thought maybe it had started raining lightly, but then I realized the tent fabric was dry. The air felt thick, like it does before a storm, but there was no breeze. I lay there still, trying to figure out why I felt so tense. Then I heard it again, that slow, careful movement outside. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. This time it was definitely close, maybe a few feet from the tent. My throat went dry. I reached for the small hatchet I always kept near the flap. My heartbeat felt so loud it almost drowned everything else. The sound moved around the tent, slow, circling. I didn't hear breathing, just the soft drag of shoes or feet on dirt. I stayed frozen, gripping the hatchet so tight my hand hurt. Then it stopped. A few seconds passed. Then I heard the faint click of metal, like a buckle or zipper. I don't know how long I lay there listening, but it felt like hours. I didn't move until the faint gray of dawn started filtering through the tent fabric. When I finally stepped outside, everything looked normal. My fire pit was still cold, untouched. The ground near the tent, though, that was different. There were shoe prints, not boots, but sneakers. They were all around my tent. Some led toward the creek, others came from the direction of the trees. They weren't mine. I wear size 11 hiking boots, and these were smaller, maybe size 9. What made it worse was how fresh they looked. Some were pressed into the soft mud like they'd been made only hours before. I looked around, half expecting to see someone nearby, but there was nothing. No backpack, no discarded trash, no signs of a campsite. Just those prints, circling me like whoever it was had been walking slowly around while I was asleep. I told myself maybe a lost hiker wandered by, but I knew how unlikely that was. This place wasn't on any trail, and the nearest public path was more than a mile away. Still, I packed my stuff, telling myself I'd leave after breakfast. When I went to fill my bottle from the creek, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Across the water, on the other bank, a few branches had been arranged in a rough triangle, leaning together like a makeshift marker. It wasn't natural, someone had done it deliberately. There were small scratches on the bark and a dark smear, maybe mud, maybe something else. I didn't cross to check. I went straight back to camp and started packing everything. Fast. While rolling my sleeping bag, I noticed my backpack zipper was open. I was sure I'd closed it before sleeping. Inside, everything looked normal except one thing. My hunting knife was gone. It was an old steel blade I always kept in a side pocket. I turned the whole bag inside out, checked the tent, checked the ground, nothing. At that point, every sound made my nerves jump. I couldn't shake the image of someone standing outside my tent in the dark, holding that knife. I stuffed everything into the car and left the area, driving way faster than I should have down the dirt road until I hit the main road back towards Sandy. By the time I got home, the sun was fully up. I locked the doors, sat down, and just stared at the floor for a long time. I didn't tell anyone for a few days because I kept trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe some local kid messing around. Maybe I dropped the knife and didn't notice. But that didn't explain the footprints circling my tent. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I drove back out there, midday this time, bright sun, clear sky. The path down to the creek was the same, but when I got to where my campsite had been, the ground was disturbed again. The grass was flattened in 2 spots, like someone else had camped there after me. There were remnants of a fire, not mine, and beside it, a piece of cloth tied to a branch, fluttering in the wind. It was my missing bandana. I used to keep it tied around my knife's handle. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. The creek sounded louder that day, maybe because I was so tense. I remember feeling like I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone around. I left it there and walked straight back to my car. That was the last time I ever went camping alone. To this day, I don't know who that person was or what they were doing there that night, but I know they were real. The footprints, the missing knife, the feeling that something was standing just outside my tent. It all happened. Every time I think about it, I imagine what would have happened if I'd unzipped the tent in the middle of the night. Maybe they would have run. Maybe not. Sometimes, when I have trouble sleeping, I'll hear that same sound again in my head. That slow, deliberate crunch of someone walking in circles, just outside thin fabric walls, waiting for something. And that's when I realize how fragile that sense of safety really is, how easily it can vanish in one quiet, dark night beside a creek. It was the summer of 2011, and I had just turned 22. I had been driving across the country for a few weeks, trying to get away from everything: work stress, city noise, people. I wanted quiet, something that felt like it belonged to me for a little while. I ended up in northern Arizona, just outside a small town called Holbrook. The area was dry, open, mostly desert and flat land, but there were patches of forest the farther you went toward the mountains. I'd read online about a place where you could camp for free, an old Forest Service road that led into a canyon. I didn't check the reviews too carefully, just saw the photos. It looked peaceful, empty, perfect. I got there in the late afternoon. The dirt road leading in was rough and narrow, the kind that makes you check your rearview mirror every minute because you don't want to meet another car. The road dipped and curved for miles until I found a small clearing surrounded by low trees and shrubs. There was a rusted fire ring in the middle of the site, old beer cans half buried in the dirt, and a couple of bullet casings scattered around. It looked like people had used it for target practice or parties, but it had clearly been empty for a while. I parked my old Jeep near a flat spot and set up my small tent. Nothing fancy, just a single-person tent and a sleeping pad. The air was hot, dry, and smelled faintly of dust and pine. I remember how still it was. No wind, no sound except for the faint buzzing of insects. I built a small fire with the branches I'd gathered and cooked a can of beans over it. As the sun dropped lower, the shadows stretched long and dark across the clearing. I could see the red glow on the rocks in the distance, and everything turned that deep orange color that makes the world look empty. I remember thinking it was exactly what I wanted, total silence. But the quiet started to feel strange once the sun was gone. I don't know how to explain it. The kind of quiet where your own breathing sounds too loud, and your heartbeat feels heavy in your chest. I was sitting by the fire, just staring at the flames, when I realized I couldn't hear a single insect anymore. No crickets, no movement. It was like someone had turned off a switch. I tried to shake it off and told myself it was just nighttime settling in. I poured some water on the fire until it dimmed to a dull red glow, then crawled into my tent. It was small and stuffy, the kind of tent where you can feel every movement outside. I lay there listening. The night was pitch dark. No moon, just a few stars behind the clouds. I could hear the sound of my sleeping bag rustling when I moved, and for a while that was all. Then I heard something else. Faint, steady crunching. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, careful, deliberate steps coming from somewhere out in the trees. They weren't close, not yet, but they were there. I held my breath, waiting, telling myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or something. But the steps didn't sound like an animal. They were too steady, too even, and I could hear them moving around, not toward me, just circling the clearing. I remember gripping the small knife I kept by my sleeping bag, my hands sweating so badly I could barely hold it. The footsteps stopped for a long time. I waited, straining my ears, but there was nothing. I finally managed to calm myself down enough to lie back and close my eyes. Then, maybe 10 or 15 minutes later, I heard the sound again, but this time closer. I could tell it was right near my Jeep. I could hear the faint scrape of metal, like someone brushing against it. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. It went on for a while. Quiet movements, something shifting near the car, then silence again. I didn't dare unzip the tent or shine my flashlight. I just waited, every second stretching out until it felt like hours. Eventually, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The first thing I did was unzip the tent and step outside. The ground was cold and damp from the night air. My fire pit was still faintly smoking. Everything looked the same except for one thing. There were footprints in the dirt near the Jeep. Human footprints. Not boot prints, not bare feet, but something in between, like worn shoes with the soles almost gone. The prints went around the Jeep, circled the fire pit once, then disappeared into the trees. I checked the car. The driver's door was slightly open. I could have sworn I'd locked it. Inside, the glove box was open, and all the papers were scattered. Nothing valuable was taken, just the small stuff messed up like someone had gone through it in a hurry. I stood there staring at the open door, trying to figure out what the hell happened. Maybe it was some local kid messing around. Maybe a drifter. But it didn't feel like a joke. I decided to pack up and leave. I could feel the hair standing up on the back of my neck the whole time. I kept looking over my shoulder into the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the same empty woods, silent and still. When I finally got back onto the main road, I stopped at a small diner about 30 minutes away. The woman at the counter looked at me like I hadn't slept, and I hadn't. I asked her if there were any homeless camps or hunters out near the forest road. She said no, not usually. Said it was too far out for that. Then she told me something that stuck with me. A few years back, a man went missing in that same area. He'd been camping alone. They found his truck, but never found him. She said it like it was just another story people tell travelers, but it hit me harder than it should have. That night, I drove until it got dark again, but I didn't stop to camp. I pulled into a rest area off the highway and slept in the back of the Jeep. The air smelled like gasoline and dust, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be somewhere with other people, even if they were strangers. I kept thinking about those footprints, how close they had come to my tent. I kept replaying the sound of those slow, quiet steps moving around me in the dark. A few days later, I couldn't get the image out of my head, so I looked up that area online trying to find stories about it. I found an old post from someone who had camped there years earlier. They described almost the exact same thing. The footsteps, the silence, the open car door in the morning. The post ended with them saying they never went camping alone again. It's been years now, but I still think about that night. Sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep, I hear those faint footsteps in my head, just slow and steady in the dirt. I don't camp anymore. I still drive, still travel, but I sleep in motels now, even if it's just a dirty roadside one. Because out there, in the middle of nowhere, you can feel how thin the line is between being alone and being watched. And every time I think back to that place, the dirt clearing, the rusted fire ring, the footprints fading into the trees, I realized something I didn't want to admit then. Whoever was out there that night didn't want my stuff. They had all the time in the world to take it. They just wanted to walk around my camp, to listen, to stand close enough to hear me breathing. And for some reason, they decided to leave. That's the part that keeps me awake. Knowing that someone was there, inches away, and chose to walk away instead of whatever else they could have done. And that choice, more than anything, is what makes it so much worse. It was late July of 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in southern France. I had been traveling through Europe for a couple of weeks, staying mostly in hostels and small inns, but I wanted a break from the cities and the crowds. I wanted some quiet. I rented a small car in Marseille and drove inland, following narrow, winding roads that passed through empty villages and endless fields of sunflowers. Eventually, I reached a forested area near the Verdun Gorge, a place I'd only picked because the pictures online looked peaceful and remote. I found a small campground that sat along a river, mostly empty except for a couple of camper vans parked far from where I set up my tent. By evening, the light was soft and golden, and the air was thick with the sound of cicadas. I cooked a small meal on my camp stove, washed up in the river, and sat near the water for a while. The current was slow, and the surface reflected the last bit of sunlight. It felt calm, quiet, and almost too still. I remember feeling completely alone, but in a way that was comforting. That changed later that night. Around 10, after the forest had gone completely dark, I was lying inside my tent reading by the small light of my phone. The air was still warm, but a faint wind made the trees creak a little. The campsite was completely quiet except for the faint hum of the river. I had turned off my phone's light and was trying to fall asleep when I thought I heard something. Soft, like footsteps on dirt. I tried to tell myself it was probably just a small animal or the wind moving branches, but the sound came again. It wasn't random or quick. It was steady, slow, someone walking. I stayed still, barely breathing, trying to listen. The steps stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. I couldn't see anything through the thin fabric of the tent, but I could hear the dry leaves crunching softly. My heart was pounding. I thought maybe it was one of the other campers, maybe someone walking to the river, but the sound came from the opposite direction, deeper in the forest. Then it stopped again. I waited a long time, just lying there in the dark. Eventually, I told myself it was probably my imagination, or maybe a wild animal moving through the woods. After a while, I forced myself to close my eyes and somehow drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The air was cool and fog hung low over the river. I stepped outside and immediately noticed something odd. The ground around my tent had a few faint footprints. They were shoe prints, not animal tracks. They were small and light, but fresh enough to tell they hadn't been there before. My stomach tightened a little. I looked around, but there was no one nearby. The camper vans I'd seen yesterday were gone. I told myself again it was nothing, that maybe someone had just walked through the campsite and I hadn't noticed. I packed my bag for a short hike and left for a few hours. The forest trail wound up through steep hills overlooking the gorge. It was beautiful, quiet, and completely isolated. By the time I came back in the afternoon, my clothes were damp with sweat and I was ready to swim in the river. When I reached my campsite, something felt different. My tent flap was open. I was sure I had zipped it before leaving. I stood still for a moment, scanning around me. Everything inside the tent looked the same. My sleeping bag, my backpack, my stove, but I still felt uneasy. I checked my things and didn't notice anything missing. Still, that feeling stuck with me, heavy in my chest. I went to the river anyway, trying to shake it off. The water was cold and refreshing. I stayed there until the light started fading, then headed back to make dinner. The forest got quiet early, the way it does when darkness starts to settle in. I remember lighting my small camp lantern and sitting beside the fire, watching the light flicker on the trees. That's when I noticed movement on the far edge of the woods. At first, I thought it was just the firelight playing tricks on my eyes. But the more I stared, the more certain I became. There was someone standing there, just far enough that I couldn't make out any details, but close enough to see the shape of a person. They weren't moving, just standing and facing my direction. A chill went through me. I stood up and looked harder. The person didn't move or make a sound. I tried to convince myself it was another camper, maybe watching from the other side of the site, but the longer I stood there, the more wrong it felt. It wasn't the way a normal person stands. It was too still, too deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. The beam of light hit the trunks, the bushes, the uneven ground, but there was no one there anymore, just empty forest. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing little sounds, branches breaking, faint movement, but every time I shined my light, there was nothing. At some point, Exhaustion took over, and I drifted in and out of uneasy sleep. When I woke up around dawn, I decided I'd had enough. I wanted to leave. I started packing my things quickly, barely stopping for breakfast. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Near the tree line, maybe 30 feet from my tent, there were a few small piles of stones, neatly stacked, 3 or 4 rocks each. I hadn't seen them before. They were arranged in a rough line facing my campsite. I didn't think twice. I threw everything in the car, not even bothering to fold my tent properly, and started driving back toward the main road. I had to pass through a few small villages before reaching the highway. In one of them, I stopped at a cafe for coffee, trying to calm down. As I sat outside, I noticed a man standing on the other side of the street. He was tall, thin, wearing a dark jacket even though it was already warm. His hair was unkempt and gray, his face long and pale. He was staring straight at me. I looked away quickly, pretending not to notice, but when I glanced back, he was still there, not moving. My hands were shaking. I finished my coffee quickly and went back to my car. When I started the engine and drove off, I looked in the mirror and saw the man still standing in the same spot, watching as I left. I didn't stop again until I reached a larger town near Aixin province. I booked a cheap hotel for the night and locked the door as soon as I got inside. I tried to convince myself it was just coincidence, that maybe he was just a local man. Maybe I was being paranoid after a couple of bad nights alone in the woods, but part of me knew that wasn't the case. The next morning, I went down to my car. It was parked on the street near the hotel. When I got closer, I saw something tucked under the windshield wiper. It was a small, folded piece of paper. My stomach dropped. I looked around quickly, but the street was empty. I unfolded the paper with trembling hands. There was nothing written on it, just a small, rough drawing, 3 stacked stones. I stared at it for a long time, my hands frozen. I threw it away immediately, got in the car, and drove straight back to Marseille. I returned the rental car that afternoon and booked an early train out of France the next morning. Even now, years later, I still think about that man. The way he stood in the trees, the way he watched me from across the street, the silence, the stones. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. Maybe he was just some strange wanderer living out there in the woods. Maybe he had been watching campers for years. All I know is that I've never gone camping alone again. Every time I think of that folded paper and those stacked stones, I feel the same coldness in my chest. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't imagination. Someone was out there watching me, waiting, and I left just soon enough to never find out what would have happened if I hadn't.